Thank you for joining us on our QTV Business and Economy program. The Business and Economy program is intended to promote the ideals of a corporate Gambia identity with the objective of forging partnerships through dialogue between the public and the private sector, civil society organizations, and the international community. In today's episode, we shall be talking to two dynamic civil servants from the public sector. They have been invited to the Business and Economy program to help us better understand and appreciate the National Development Plan, the economic development blueprint that should guide the economic development aspirations of this country for the next 3 years, from 2018 to 2021. Within our midst, we have the Permanent Secretary, Ibrahima Sissawo, from Office of the President. We also have in our midst the Director from Development Planning at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, Mr. Alaji Fadera. I would give a brief overview of Mr. Pierce, Mr. Ibrahima Sissawo, and of course the Director of Development Planning at MOFIA. Pierce Sissawo is Permanent Secretary at Office of the President. He has served as Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Higher Education, Research, Science and Technology. He has also served as Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education and has equally served as Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Public Management Office and also the Ministry of Tourism and Culture. Mr. Fadera is the Director of Development Planning at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, and he has served as Principal Economist under the then Ministry of Economic Planning and Industrial Development. He has also served as an economic specialist at the then National Planning Commission and has also served as lecturer at the University of the Gambia. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to the both of you to the Business and Economy program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you.
Let me first seize this opportunity to congratulate the both of you in your efforts in coordinating and creating our economic development agenda blueprint, the National Development Plan. We are much encouraged from the public sector that you have decided to come on this program to share with us the vision as has been encapsulated under that program. By way of introduction, could you please, Mr. Fadera, explain to us give us a brief overview in terms of the National Development Plan, how the blueprint was conceived and the consultations that emanated during that process, so that we can better appreciate the degree of engagement that has occurred during the conceptualization of this program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts, and we are really very pleased to be here on this platform today to communicate with the entire country and beyond on this very important national document, which is the National Development Plan. And as the name implies, it's a national development plan, not a government development plan. And its formulation should reflect such. If we look at the formulation of the National Development Plan, it was very consultative. We went around the length and breadth of this country, had consultations with the grassroots at district level for the first time in the history of the Gambia. Previously, most of the consultations were just at regional level, but for the first time, we had what we call common country assessment that was jointly conducted with the United Nations system in country, and we reached as low as at the district level, and we met different stakeholders, including men, women, youth, as well as other stakeholders at that level. Up and above the common country assessment, where we interacted with the people to know what has worked as far as previous national development plans are concerned, like the Poverty Reduction Strategies Paper 1 and 2, as well as the Program for Accelerated Growth and Employment. They were able to tell us what they felt really worked, but what the challenges are, and what the government should focus on going forward. There were also different studies, like we had the Integrated Household Survey, where there was a household survey to look at household characteristics, socioeconomic, looking at poverty levels, looking at access to education, access to health, and other development indicators. And there were also various studies along sectoral lines, along thematic lines, and we also constituted, very importantly, what is called the thematic working groups. in agriculture and natural resources, for example, in tourism, in the macroeconomy, on public sector governance, that's public financial management, infrastructure, etc. And these thematic working groups didn't only constitute of government. It constituted of government, civil society, as well as the private sector, but also, most importantly, our resident development partners. Following all these consultations and technical work, we also had the benefit of a consultant who worked with us to coordinate and make sure that all these ideas are encapsulated in various drafts which were subjected to various validation. And in all this, we didn't forget the important role that the National Assembly could play. And we interacted with them as well as with Cabinet, where presentations of the draft were done and we had their input. So following all these consultations, both at the grassroots level, at the national level, with development partners, with other stakeholders, we came with a final draft that was validated, which was then finalized and which was launched in February 2018 to serve as the National Development Plan for the Gambia for the period 2018 and 2021. So you can see that the process has been very, very consultative and included different stakeholders up and above government.
Okay. Well, thank you. I know you said that the consultations have been quite comprehensive, and you've gone to the level of the grassroots. Incidentally, this program, we are now on our 14th episode, and I remember the first 3 episodes that we had. We had invited Tango, the Madi Jabate, I think he's a manager, at Tango, and the NDP was discussed, at that time, I wanted to get their ideas in terms of the degree of consultation that would have emanated. Whilst I appreciate the fact that, yes, you had consulted, but I believe there might have been pockets in which consultations did not happen at that end, or maybe perhaps lack of knowledge as well, because sometimes people would say, well, we were not consulted, when in reality there has been some consultation. Because I also remember having the National Assembly member here on ICT, and I had raised the questions to them, and those episodes discussed, in a little bit the National Development Plan, given the call that was made by the President that we need to table this, we need to discuss this, within the economy, so that people could better appreciate and understand this issue. The point I want to make here is, are there plans within the NDP itself for periodic reviews and maybe periodic consultations to perhaps onboard some of the issues and the ideas that people might felt that their views were not taken on board when the plan was conceived?
Yes, exactly. There is provision for that, because no plan is cast in stone. It's dynamic, and we've made provision for quarterly reviews. Quarter, maybe PSC South will dilate more on this. The first one was held in April. Another one is being planned. But up and above that, there will be annual progress reviews, which will at least show us what achievements we're making, whether there is any need for us to at least make changes in course of action or in the way we're implementing certain strategies. There would be a midterm evaluation, and there would be a terminal evaluation. And accepted, there could be gray areas here and there in terms of consultation. There is always room for improvement. But I could remember vividly that we wrote to some of these apex institutions, like the Gambia Chamber of Commerce and Industry, to help coordinate the participation of the private sector in these thematic working groups, and Tango as the apex body for most of the NGOs and civil society. We know that you have some private sector players who are not necessarily members of GCCI. Yes. You also have some civil society who are not necessarily the members of Tango, but it is difficult for us to know all this. Yes. We have to use these apex bodies. And up and above this, we even had following the finalization of the National Development Plan, I can remember recently, about a few months ago, we had an interaction with civil society and NGOs at Tango, at their conference room, where we discussed the finalized National Development Plan. And I think this is a route that government is committed to taking to make sure that everybody across the board is sensitized. We've just concluded the regional sensitization of all the LGAs, including the municipalities and the Banjul City Council. So we really would continue to do this and also disseminate any information that comes from the reviews that you're talking about.
Well, and I think equally by the same token, there is nothing stopping some of these institutions and agencies, if they hear that something is being conceived, for them to go and make a representation in terms of their interest. Absolutely. But yes, thank you very much, viewers, for joining us. We are discussing the National Development Plan. As you can see, it's quite a comprehensive document. This is our topic of discussion today, and we have invited two guests from the public sector who would help us to better understand this. Piers, let me come to you. For the implementation of the National Development Plan, there is no, doubts that money is needed, funding, as we would always say, I mean, we need money to implement the National Development Plan. And we know that His Excellency, had a conference, roundtable conference in Belgium, in which the EU has pledged, 1.45 billion in terms of the development of this national export strategy. I mean, the National Development Plan. But needless to say, there are critics out there who said that there hasn't been much transparency in terms of, what is the composition of this 1.45 billion. Are you in a position to share with us, this 1.45 billion, what is it earmarked for? Are there special sectors that we are looking at? And also, is the funding enough? And if the funding is not enough, what are we looking at in terms of bridging the funding gap?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on your program. I think that's a very important question that you are just referring to me. Like Director Fadil has just said, there have been a lot of consultations on the process of development plan. Apart from the development of this plan, just recently the director and this team were engaged on an awareness campaign, and this have covered all the regions. And then a lot of things have been discussed about the development plan. Yes, regarding the funding, people are aware of the fact that there was a donor conference in Brussels recently, and then 1.45 billion euro was raised to cover the cost, the funding gap for the National Development Plan. This support is coming in different form. Some of them are in form of projects. Some of them are direct technical support. Some are budget support as well. And these have been broken down in various components. Right now, the Office of the President is working with the Minister of Finance to work with the sectors that are going to benefit from this funding, so that we help them to develop their strategic plans and align it with the National Development Plan to facilitate the implementations of these projects. Yes, there will still be some little gaps in terms of the funding, but we are hopeful that with the proper implementation process, it's always possible to make a follow-up request for support to complete the process of the development process. I think the conditions that would be required for government is to make sure that we respect our governance process. Once we are able to maintain our governance processes, it shouldn't always be difficult to engage our donor partners to further support some of the pending projects. Again, if you look at the support has been directed to some of the productive base of the economy. And this has the possibility of expanding our revenue sector. And in essence, what that would mean is that the government will be empowered to do its own internal fund revenue generations to support some of the supplementary projects. The Gambia has of recent had a very good image outside, and then I think that's an opportunity for us to bank on and then mobilize our donor partners to come on board, not only in terms of support, but also in terms of foreign direct investments. If you look at some of the projects, they are geared towards supporting the infrastructural improvement. And this is exactly what we need in our country right now. Once we are able to improve our infrastructure, there is a possibility of attracting more funding and more investment into our economy. And this is an opportunity to raise more revenue for the country and to invest in to reinvest and then further support some of the gaps that we would have in our economic activity. A classic example is the energy sector, because you need a stable energy. If you look at the National Development Plan, one of our strategic objective is to make it a private-led growth. So, which in essence means that the private sector would have to lead, be the engine of growth for the economy. But realistically, that's only possible if you have the enabling environment, the infrastructure, the energy, the proper road network. Because without all those things, you can only claim that we want the private sector, but will you be able to attract them? Practically, it's not possible. So the 8 priority strategies in our plan, in more or less, is trying to look at how we address those shortcomings in our economy, so that we can invite people, we can invite the international investors to support the development process of the country.
Mr. Roberts, if I may comment, just by way of clarification, the 1.45 billion euros is not only pledged by the EU, but it's pledged by all the partners that were present. So the EU pledged, the World Bank and others, about close to over 30 partners were present at the international conference, and most of them pledged varying degrees of resources. In terms of transparency, I think the process has been very transparent, because at the end of the international conference, a press release was issued to indicate the amount that was mobilized. So this is in the public domain. And the fact that the president also went on a recently concluded tour to tell the citizens how much has been mobilized in terms of pledges is also another indication of transparency on the part of government. And like PSC Sao indicated, when we went around the regional sensitization, we did indicate to the citizens the amount that has been mobilized in pledges. And we spent a lot of time and effort to try and distinguish pledges and commitments, so that they know that these are pledges. Pledges, more or less, you can say, are kind of promises, and they're different from actual commitment. So like some of the citizens may want to understand, like it was fiscal cost that the president and delegation came with. It's not necessarily the case. Some of these are what are pledges. Some are already committed. We've seen like they're already in program areas. Some have already been signed on, like the pledged by the French, the EU. Most of the pledges are already in commitments under the NIP, that's the National Indicative Program, etc. Most of the pledges by the World Bank is already in what we call the country engagement note, etc. So there is great degree of transparency as far as the pledges are concerned, because these are public resources, and government doesn't have any alternative but to make sure that it's very transparent in the execution and in the access of these resources.
I'm glad you were making that clarification, Mr. Fadera, because as you rightly said, some people out there in the public domain have said that the 1.45 billion is cash, and we all know that that is not necessarily the case. Because and I think it also helps that you are making it clear on this program for people to understand. Because you don't want a situation where at the end of the 3 years, people come and say, well, you received 1.45 billion in cash. Where did you put all that money? So I think it is good for people to understand that these are pledges and that, yes, they are commitments. And as PS rightly said, the governance framework of the country needs to be respected, and that should give comfort to the donors so that the pledges would begin to, trickle in and, become, actuals. But PS, let me just do a follow-up question in terms of some of the points that you alluded to. You made reference to infrastructure, that, these pledges will be directed and targeted to the productive sectors of the economy, to help, the requisite growth that we are looking at and employment generation as well, amongst others. In terms of infrastructure, I just want to understand, if that is possible, where does ICT feature in that infrastructural development? Are we talking of infrastructure in terms of physical infrastructure, or does it also include the communications aspect? I raised this question because I had a forum on ICT, and then, you know, I invited the minister, and, you know, he had also, I mean, we spoke about the National Development Plan and what his priorities are for ICT and how ICT could be leveraged to help us as a country to begin to, become the likes of Rwanda. So where does ICT feature in that infrastructural target?
Thank you very much again. Yes, IT is a critical component of the whole development strategy. If you critically look at the National Development Plan, the idea is to enhance growth through the use of ICT. Not only at the level of productive base, but also even at the public sector. We want to enhance the performance and the implementation process at the public sector using the ICT as an engine. E-governance is a critical component of that. And then a project, flagship projects have been developed around that, and then this is one of the components that has attracted funding. And then for sure it will be implemented along the line.
Okay. Yeah. And I think if you look at because we have 8 strategic priorities and 7 critical enablers. The 6th critical enabler is focused on ICT for development, because we know that whatever you do now, it will be very difficult for you to achieve your development results unless and until you are able to harness ICT, whether it's in the public sector, whether it is in agriculture, whether it is in other areas, education, health, etc. So this has really been adequately recognized in the National Development Plan, and that's why you have a whole critical enabler revolving around ICT for development.
Thank you very much. I would do a follow-up question, one that Piers alluded to, but I would give the follow-up question to you, Mr. Fadera. Incidentally, you are at the ministry that also houses the public-private partnership units. And I know that Piers had made the point that, you know, the NDP is focused in terms of having a private sector-led development agenda. You know, this is the idea. This is what we want to do. And, you know, I mean, you know, rightly so, because honestly, in an economy, yes, government has to provide the enabling environment, but the private sector has to be seen to be in the lead in working in consort with the public sector to help us, you know, push our, economic development agenda forward. I just want to understand from where you sit within the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, what provisions are there in terms of engaging the private sector under a PPP framework? I mean, I know that some initiatives have been made, because I've seen, reading from the papers, that there was a meeting that was called in which people were present. You know, could you expand on that? Could you give us more ideas so that at least people in the private sector would know the opportunities that exist, you know, within the NDP?
I think that's really very important, because for a long time as a government we've been talking about private sector-led growth. And I think even in the formulation of this National Development Plan, government wanted to make sure that the private sector are part and parcel of it, so that in the identification of the priority areas, they are part and parcel of it. And that did happen to some extent, though there were challenges, you know, like the differences in the way sometimes we work in the public sector, and this was really very time demanding. Sometimes, you know, time is money for the private sector, so to have them all the time around these thematic working groups is sometimes very expensive for them. But that recognition, you know, at the Ministry of Finance, we already have a fully fledged public-private partnership directorate. We already have a PPP policy that has been approved, and we're working on some other instruments. But in recognition of the critical role that the private sector could play, that's why the international conference was for 2 days. The first day was the 22nd, was the pledging conference. The second day brought together the private sector. You had Gambian private sector who paid. Some of them paid their own own expenses to go and attend. And we brought along, there were international private sector, European, beyond Europe, who attended that private sector forum to discuss all these strategic priority areas of the National Development Plan and the critical enabler, and to look at some of the investment opportunities that exist. And if you look at some of the areas we're talking about, like in energy, like in infrastructure, like port expansion, government is really interested in making sure that we have public-private partnerships in this area. Because you have the private sector who in some instances or many instances have the funds. And sometimes they even have the capacity and the track record operating in some of these areas. So instead of going and how do you call it, contracting expensive loans or loans already looking at our debt situation, if the private sector can come in and partner with government with very little recourse to public resources, that's good for both the private sector as well as government, because government will be able to deliver that particular public good and the private sector will be able to get some returns on investment. And I think recently we've seen some activity by some private sector players. Recently, I think I was watching the news and I saw some private sector players who have come to express their interest in what? In the port expansion project. And we've seen documents that are coming to relevant ministries like the Ministry of Works and Infrastructure and other relevant government agencies from the private sector expressing their interest to invest in some of these areas. And government is really committed to making sure that it partners with the private sector in some of these areas so that we will be able to at least deliver some vital infrastructure and some vital public goods for the population at minimum cost to the public purse, and the private sector will be able to also be able to thrive.
And where the wealth creation will equally stay, or most of it would stay within country, yeah. And that would help us to, you know. Now, if people are, the private sector players who are interested in public-private partnership initiatives, if, for example, their interest in, is in port expansion, should they go to the ports or should they come to the PPP unit at the Ministry of Finance, or should they go to OP, just by way of guidelines so that they know, you know, how to approach?
Yeah, I think clearly, like, how do you call it? So government, we work together.
Yes.
We work collectively. Okay, when private sector are interested, the public-private partnership, to a large extent, is involved in the discussions, in the negotiations, to make sure that they link to the how do you call it, the appropriate government agencies. GIPA is in the know, the Office of the President is in the know, the relevant government sector is also in the know. So we work together. Okay, sometimes they may enter using different routes, like maybe directly through the public-private partnership directorate at the Ministry of Finance, or sometimes through GIPA. But what we all understand, because we know all the relevant stakeholders as far as particular projects are concerned, we make sure that all the relevant stakeholders within government are made available to sit down with some of these potential investors to discuss these issues so that we are able to at least make headway, and that as a government we are able to speak the same voice.
Yeah, just to add to what he just said, the point of entry is not very much an issue, because we receive such proposals at the level of OP. Sometimes it is at the level of GIPA or the institutions that is relevant in a particular case. But what we do, particularly at the level of OP, is because we don't implement, but we coordinate. So whenever we get such kind of proposal, we always look at the proposal, review it. If it has legal implications, we normally would refer it to justice for their legal opinion. Then once we get that legal opinion, then we engage stakeholders, then also make follow-up to ensure that the person making proposal is engaged, and then the proposal is reviewed by the technicians. And then if it's viable, then we work on the implementations of those the proposal.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Going back to the issue of funding, 1.45 billion euros is quite a substantial amount of money, and I'm sure it would go a long way in helping to fund and implement the NDP. But I'm sure equally that the overall cost of the implementation of the NDP is beyond the 1.45 billion. I know peers mentioned that, yes, there would be shortfalls, but there are opportunities in terms of even realizing future commitments from donor partners, providing the governance framework of the country is respected in the implementation of the NDP. But I just want to ask, and I know we're discussing PPP, so this is an appropriate question. In view of the fact that the government has taken informed decision to bring the interest rates on treasury bills down for obvious reasons, trying to control our national debt amongst others. And then now the likes of the commercial banks who used to park a lot of their funds in treasury bills because it was risk-free money, it's easy returns. What opportunities, are there opportunities available for the, for the banks since considering the fact that they are sitting on so much liquidity now that treasury bills are not as attractive as they used to be, and we know the challenges of lending within the economy because of poor financial record keeping, are there opportunities for the banks, to come and partner with government as well, because they have a role to play in terms of the National Development Plan? What opportunities exist for them?
I think it's important that you acknowledge upfront some of the improvements in some of the areas, like especially interest rates, okay, because government has reduced domestic borrowing, and we have seen that having positive impact on interest rates, and we've also seen that that's having positive spillover, because like we say in economics, government borrowing can crowd out private sector investment. So if government, and that has been happening. So if government rolls back, that means more funds will be available for the private sector. And the statistics that we're seeing now is that the commercial banks are increasing lending to the private sector, even to the productive sector, which we have been complaining we're kind of stopped, because over the years in the past, we've seen a declining trend in lending to some of these productive sectors like agriculture, like fisheries. But we're seeing these things picking up. So we believe if this policy, the fiscal discipline and the resultant reduction in domestic borrowing gains more momentum, we will see even increased investment in some of these areas. So the banks can participate by lending to private sector players who are in some of these areas. Previously, we know with the high interest rates is like prohibitive for anybody who wants to go into agriculture to go and borrow from a commercial bank and invest. Because at the end of the day, that means what you will have to pay just in terms of servicing that loan is what is so huge. But now the interest rates are coming down, and now that we're seeing some appetite on the part of the commercial banks to lend to some of these areas, which they were otherwise not doing as we expect them to do, for us is an indication that the commercial banks are participating in national, that means their participation in national development is being enhanced up and above borrowing or lending to government per se. So it doesn't probably necessarily mean like the commercial banks coming with their own projects and implementing it, but they can they support the implementation by lending to private sector players. Some of those who are probably interested in some of these infrastructure areas, when they come, probably they would want some form of financing from our banks. Some maybe local players who are interested in the productive sector, like we're talking about livestock, we're talking about expanding rice production, etc. And we know that there are private sector, local private sector, who are already active in this area. So the reduction in interest rates and the enabling environment that is creating, we think is creating is creating positive spillovers for those people who are investing in national development by investing in some of those productive sectors. No, we've seen support, like we've seen support, direct support, like we work with some banks where we've been able to work together on presentation to entice private sector to invest in in the National Development Plan. Okay, for example, you were talking about Standard Chartered. In the build up to the international conference, the Ministry of Finance worked very closely with Standard Chartered Bank because they've supported other countries in trying to help them prepare presentations because of their multinational nature to be able to entice private sector investment into the country. And we worked together with them on that. And this was something that was shared with the private sector during the private sector forum. And we're seeing a lot of interest from the private sector coming. And in fact, some of those banks, like principally Standard Chartered, was represented at the private sector forum.
Yes, the point I'm trying to get to, Mr. Fodera, is government has brought down the policy rate of the central bank, which is the rediscount rate. And we know that treasury bill rates have crashed. But if you go to the banks, the commercial banks, lending, while some of the rates have come down, we've not seen a commensurate decline in commercial lending rates vis-a-vis the magnitude in which the policy rate of the central bank has come down. So the point I'm making now, and I know and I understand that is gradual. I had the Standard Chartered Bank CEO on this forum, and we discussed this. And we know that there'll be a lag because you already have exposures out there. By the time people pay, and within our economy, we're also challenged because people hardly keep financial records, and a commercial bank would not lend to you if you're not keeping financial records. The point I was trying to get at, and I'm glad you mentioned this, is are there participatory roles for the commercial bank directly into you know, the implementation of the National Development Plan. Say, for example, where, you know, banks could say, okay, we're sitting on so much money, we are not able to lend because we want to lend, but we are not able to lend as much as we want to because people don't keep financial records, for example. Or people's track record, they don't have available track records in terms of lending and repayment schedules. Yeah, but we want to participate, and we are sitting on so much liquidity. Is there a vehicle, a consortium, for example, you know, in which, say, for example, they could lend to government, and then government could now use those funds, or have a special arrangement where they could now push some of these productive sectors by, lending directly into them, with government providing, you know, some sort of assurance. That is the point I'm trying to get to. Yes.
I think if you look at what the financing arrangements of the NDP, talking about innovative financing, up and above PPPs, to issues including blended finance, where probably government will contribute a certain amount from public resources and we'll have private sector participation. So it is possible within that innovative finance, where we have special purpose vehicles, where government will put in funds, where the private sector, like commercial bank, will put in some funds, and these funds will be employed or deployed to sectors where there will be returns on investment, where the private sector, like the banks, will get their returns on investment, and other players or other private sector players can also get their returns on investment. And if that means like government's investment will, let's say, create the enabling environment and reduce the risk, that's something that we can do within the framework of the National Development Plan. We hope like we have this kind of appetite and we have this kind of innovation on the part of the banks, because it also means like the banks will have to go out of the traditional zone that we have all been used to just lending directly to government through treasury bills, and at the end of the day, they collect the returns on the T-bills, going into innovative financing, which will probably be a little bit riskier than the treasury bills investment.
Exactly. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you've made that point. So the banks sitting on excess liquidity, they know they have an avenue through which they could now enhance their lending, and in the process to help develop this economy and create the jobs that are needed within the economy. Let me come to you, Piers, in terms of energy. We know that energy is a critical issue as long as national development is concerned. And I know that, to address the challenge of electricity, we have heard that over $500 million would be needed, to help, bring the energy sector, up to scratch. What is your take? Do you foresee that by the time we hit 2020, the energy challenges would have abated, would have been addressed? I mean, what is your take on that?
Energy is critical. We can say no progress without energy. And I think we've all seen we've all gone through a difficult period when there was a shortage of energy in the country. This has virtually shut down most activities at the level of household, at the level of production. One thing people may not even realize is that without proper energy, you may not be able to attract proper investments. So you could imagine the amount or the level of opportunity the country is missing out because of our low level of energy production. So that is why, as a #1 priority for the president is energy, and then he has been saying this on all the forums. Yes, there is a very good roadmap as far as energy production is concerned, and then it's been implemented. And I think everybody has seen results of progress being made so far. I'm very, very hopeful with the kind of roadmap that is presented, which is very practical and is funded. There are funding opportunities for the roadmap. We're very hopeful that within a very short period, the issue of energy will be resolved. If you, we have different components that are going to that are put together to support the energy production. We have the renewable, we have the will you have so, but I think for now the biggest challenge for energy is the transmission and distribution. So the supply of energy is available, but then the route through which it should pass to get to the final consumer is what is a challenge. And it is good. It is a happy note that funding to transform the distribution, transmission and distribution network has also been acquired, and then very soon they will start working on that. And I think once we are able to uphold, transform that, and the issue of energy will be seriously improved, and then that will definitely trickle down on the other aspect of our economy. So there is a lot of hope as far as the development process is concerned.
Okay, Mr. Fadera, let me come to you. We spoke about the relevance of the private sector in our economic development aspirations, that it should be private sector led. And I think if we look at the composition of the economy from the private sector perspective, we have the informal sector and the formal sector. We have had complaints from the formal sector in terms of the size of the informal sector and how the informal sector pretty much gets away with murder in terms of government not being able to effectively task them because they operate, you know, underground, you know, if you know what I mean. I know the formal sector, whilst they are out and about and everybody knows them, you know, it is a challenge on the side of the informal sector. What is it, you know, if any, that the NDP is doing to help formalize the informal sector? Because I believe if that happens, with the plans that government have to gradually reduce taxes, we would be able to realize that. And not only that, but we'll be able to bring those people who are employed, who are not within the economic mainstream, to be part of the economic mainstream. And that in itself would also help government to realize some revenues and also count the number of people who are employed. Because right now, people will tell you that unemployment is so high, but in reality, there are people who are employed but are not being counted as employed. So what is it that the NDP has in plan to help address the size of the informal sector, especially within the vehicle of technical assistance? Are we making appeals to the World Bank, to the IMF to come and help us in that regard to first understand the size of the informal sector, and what structure do we need to put in place to formalize the informal sector?
Yeah, I think one thing, this is very much in the interest of what? Of the government. Because we know, like, it's not just about increasing tax rates, but the most important thing for the Gambia and most developing countries is to broaden the tax base. And if you have to broaden the tax base in many developing countries, including the Gambia, that means you must try as much as possible create the enabling environment to be able to bring the informal sector into the tax net by making sure that they are formal. As part of these reforms, we will know that the government has established a single business registration window. We know that previously it is what? It's like a nightmare for one to register businesses in the Gambia, because you have to go to so many different government departments and agencies to pay for certain registration documents here, to collect certain items here before you are able to finally register. Now, if you have all your documentation right, you just go to a one-stop shop and you can do your registration in a day. Think this is what? This is really going to help the informal sector, because apart from what? The time, sometimes the time it takes could be what? Could be kind of discouraging. If it's going to take you a month or more for you to run around government department just to get your business registered, that could be discouraging. Two, we will also say that as part of the 2018 budget, government has made attempts to reduce some of the tax rates. Okay, like personal income tax has been what? Has been reduced. Corporate income tax has been reduced. These are all geared towards sending a very good signal to the private sector, so that we'll be able to have the private sector thrive, and we'll also be able to move some of this informal sector from what? From the informal sector to the formal sector. And there are studies to try and assess the size of what? The informal sector. And again, like you said, this is very difficult, but we are working with what? We are working with our our partners, some of our development partners, to try and do some of these kinds of studies and find innovative ways of further encouraging informal sector to become formal. Because this is a problem in the Gambia, but we should also recognize that it's not only a problem in the Gambia, it's a problem in the global south, in all developing countries. If you look at most developing countries, bulk of what economic activity is in the informal sector. So as a result, government what? Or the state loses out, because that means you have to depend on relatively small formal sector to be able to mobilize domestic revenues, which you use to finance your budget. So government is really working very hard in this area to make sure that the formal sector, the informal sector becomes formalized. And one thing that is also important here is policy consistency. And I think government is really committed to making sure that it has policy consistency going forward. Because if there's no policy consistency, then it can deter informal sector from what? From trying to register to become formal. If today you have what? Reduction in tax rates, and all of a sudden you have a reversal in that, or you open up certain areas of the economy to private sector investment, and all of a sudden government what? Government reverses that, or government goes into that big time, it hurts what? It hurts some of these private sector players, and as a result they don't see some kind of incentive, real incentives in becoming formal or in scaling up their operations. So government wants to make sure that it has this policy consistency, because that is very, very important. Like in government, we say, or in economics, we talk about signaling theory. At the end of the day, if you have good signals, that can attract a lot of private sector players into the economy.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you, and I think the initiatives that government is taking is commendable. But all of these initiatives in terms of lowering taxes, all of these initiatives in terms of government being consistent in its, policies, in terms of the signals it sends out there, all of these ultimately, and the one-stop shop as well, all of these are supposed to be enticers and encourages for people who are operating in the informal sector to now come on the economic mainstream, the formal economic mainstream. But there would be, and you would agree with me on this one, that there are those cohort of businesses who prefer to operate within the informal sector, and for obvious reasons. One, they want to evade tax. One, they want to employ people behind the scenes, and then, don't pay the requisite, obligations by way of social security. They don't want to contribute to the injuries compensation fund, amongst a host of other things. These people, they have to be made, not from a voluntary perspective, but they have to, government have to also put in plans in place to ensure that, they become on the informal, on the formal mainstream, and that has to be mandatory. This is what I'm asking. So what are the plans? Government introduced the, the TIN, the tax identification number. Yeah, that in itself for me is one platform in which people who are operating in the informal mainstream could be brought into the formal mainstream. So those are the instruments that I'm talking about. And we have the national ID card. Yes, we have not gone to biometric yet, but perhaps in the process of going biometric, can we now have a correlation or a link between the TIN and the national ID card, so that anybody who's transacting any business, if you do not have those two instruments, and that would help in the process to now formalize those people who don't want to be formalized because they're enjoying.
I think like I said, at the end of the day, government wants to make sure that, because government also doesn't want to, how do you call it, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Because like sometimes if you use coercion, government has a lot of powers, okay? But sometimes if you use a lot of coercion, it could have what? It could have a lot of unintended consequences, probably, which we don't want. And that's why government is having a lot of initiatives. The issue of capacity building. We know that under the YEP project, on the GUIDE project, you have a lot of capacity building, which is reaching out to some of these informal sector players, including young entrepreneurs, trying to teach them the basics of record keeping as far as their businesses are concerned. And we know that like most of this work, a lot of the informal sector also want to grow. And they know that unless and until they invest some efforts in becoming formal, it becomes very difficult for them to grow. We talked about banks won't lend to what? Won't lend to businesses that do not have proper records. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that this capacity building also points to the fact that it is in your interest, not just government trying to build your capacity so that you register, you become formal, and government taxes you. But it's also in your interest for expansion purposes and for purposes of having track record as far as your business is concerned to become formal. So that at the end of the day, they see it as what? Something of a mutual benefit, that it is not only in government's benefit to get them to become formal, but it is also in their own benefit to become formal so that they can have access to what? Access to funds outside their own funds, that means their own personal funds or their own family funds. And a lot of businesses would want to grow. Like if I have a small mechanic workshop, probably I want to grow. If I have a small carpentry workshop, I want to grow. But some of them probably don't see or are not adequately sensitized to know that you cannot just knock on the doors of a bank and say, oh, I have a business and I want a loan. They will ask you, is your business registered? And most of them are realizing that. So you're having some of them trying to be formal so that they can what? They can access alternative sources of funding. Even government has a lot of what? Support for some of these MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises. But unless and until they're formal, they have some kind of documentation, it becomes very difficult for government to support them because they have to be identified. If the business is not identified, how do you provide that kind of support? So I think with all these efforts and all this initiative, eventually a lot of small, micro, and medium enterprises that are in the informal sector would gradually appreciate the importance and the benefits of becoming formal, not just for the benefit of government, but for also their own benefit.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just to add to what he said, the problem to some extent is little awareness, and I think that's where government need to improve on. The perception generally in the informal sector is that if you become formal, you end up paying excessive tax, and then at the end of the day, you are edged out of the business, and that's exactly what is discouraging most of them becoming formal. But then, like he said, government has made a lot of good moves in terms of reducing tax, and there are a lot of opportunities for those informal sectors if they become formal, because there are supports and there are opportunities that you can they can be merged against international partners to grow their business. Because like everyone, you go into business not to stay stagnant. You want to grow, and the only way you can grow is if you become formal. Because a lot of opportunities are there. The banks, other international support. It becomes practically impossible if you don't formalize your business. And I think Minister of Trade, in particular, would expand on their awareness to reach out to this informal sector, so that more of them can come on board. It is important for them, but it's also important for government in terms of broadening the tax base, which are plowed back to create more enabling environment for more businesses to grow in the system.
And I agree, because even I know the tax codes in this country, GRA would not tax you if at all your turnover, it's not up to a particular, so these are all opportunities as well. I mean, you could be in the formal, you could come out from the informal into the formal mainstream, and as long as you're providing your quarterly returns. If the assessment from GRA is that, okay, your turnover is not up to the, minimum, exactly, you don't pay tax, but the idea is to get them to realize all of these things so that we can bring them within the economic mainstream, because that would help not only government, but themselves, as well. But Piers, let me come to you, and I know that under the Jammeh administration, the issue of, public sector reform, the civil service, has been put aside. Especially in the last 1-2 years. During which time, I was within government as well. And if we look at the Global Competitiveness Index ranking, of the Gambia, it, talks about or has the civil service identified as, an area where there is a challenge in terms of capacity. I know Fadera would tell me that yes, that is within the National Development Plan. But how soon are we going to see implementation regarding trying to up the skills and the capacity of the civil service and trying to bring requisite necessary changes in order for it to be able to implement the NDP?
Yeah, thank you very much. The civil service reform program under Jammeh administration, it started, but then it had a lot of challenges. Not much progress were made. The pension reform, the pay reform, where some of the things that were discussed and were meant to be supported by UNDP at the time. But then much progress were not made. Recently, as there is a follow-up on that. A civil service reform strategy document has been developed. This is a very comprehensive document that's going to look at how some of the challenges in the civil service. And then key component of that strategy document is how to improve discipline and ethics in the civil service. And this part of the fourth component of the strategy that's going to be implemented. The document has been presented at the cabinet and it has been approved at the level of cabinet. So we are waiting for the next level for the implementation. Talking of how are we going to develop the capacity of the public sector to be able to implement the National Development Plan. I think Fadera would confirm that a capacity gap assessment has been already done with regards to the implementation of this plan, and then we've already identified the gaps that we need to improve on to be able to start implementing. So I think that's a very good start. Once we are able to build those capacities, we will be able to have a public sector that is ready to be able to implement. But we should also forget the fact that this is a document that is developed mainly by the public servants. This is a locally developed document. So this is their ideas. So so with little support, they shouldn't have that much difficulties in implementing the ideas that they put forward for development. And it's a very good document because it has been marketed, and then international organizations, the reason why they are committing their funds for the support is because the objectives, the strategies highlighted in documents are very clear.
Mr. Fadera, I would give you the last word, but you only have 1 minute. I know you are very passionate when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. From having engaged with you previously, the National Development Plan is to be implemented 2018-2021. One of the challenges in Africa in terms of us realizing our national development blueprints is monitoring. Your commitment, your word in terms of monitoring and evaluation regarding the NDP, will we get there come 2021? If I invite you to the forum.
Yeah, I think we are very optimistic that we can get there as a country. And if we look at the National Development Plan, we have a very clear results measurement framework in terms of baselines on key indicators. Where are we and where do we intend to be by end 2021? That's the targets. And in terms of what we can see, a keen desire on the part of what government, in terms of this quarterly reporting, which is being chaired by the president himself, to keep track of progress. That is something that is also very encouraging. And we can also see that government is, with support from development partners like the UNDP, etc., trying to invest even more resources in building capacity in monitoring and evaluation. So we think we have a very clear results framework, that we're going to develop capacity, and that we will have regular fora like the quarterly reporting. We will have mid-term evaluation of the National Development Plan, annual progress reports, and we know with the enhanced democracy that we're seeing, that the citizens, because M&E also needs a demand side, that we will have what? We will have a lot of calls for accountability on the part of the citizen. So if anything, this will strengthen monitoring and evaluation of the plan.
Gentlemen, peers, thank you very much for coming on the program. Thank you for enlightening us.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Fadera, thank you very much for coming on the program. Thank you for enlightening us. And we wish you all the very best.
Thank you.
Viewers, this is the plan. Get your copy. It's available on the internet. Understand your country. Understand the National Development Plan, the blueprint that underpins this economic development transformation for the next 3 years. Thank you.